A couple weeks ago, I did This Week in the Life of Jesus through Holy Week, and we looked at what events happened in the last week of Jesus' life, Monday through Friday, and through the crucifixion. And we got a lot of great responses, so I wanted to carry that with a new webcast, video cast, whatever this is, podcast about this week. And we're looking at this week in church history. C.S. Lewis once said, for every modern book you read an old book, read a dead person. And the reason for that is because everything modern, even though it might be really good material, it's been untested. But old books and those who have come before us, it's been tested, both the successes and the failures. And church history is a little bit like that. We don't just look at the modern church, we look at the church through all time, because both the faithfulness and the failures of the church in the past get seen, and we know them, and then we get to look at our own current context. And we're in a pandemic as a church. Well, this is not the first time the church has been in a pandemic. And so some of these will be fun, some of them will be informative, some of them will be things that maybe you never knew before, but maybe all a little bit challenging in the way that we think about church history and we think about our own modern context. So I want to talk about two things today. And the first one is pastor preacher John Nelson Darby, Irishman. So here I gotta trade outfits here. Irishman, born in 1800s, died this week in 1882. Went to Trinity College. Really struggled with the established church. Had a hard time figuring out where he fit. Ultimately became a preacher, pastor. And then out of that became the founder of the Brethren Church movement, and that's still around today. And here's the great thing about pastor preacher John Nelson Darby: not only does he have an amazing mug, look at that mug, but he has had a profound effect. And so this first part of church history is just being thankful for those who have gone before us that have really held to the gospel and have kept it for us. A couple things that you should know about Pastor John Darby. One, he helped complete the Old Testament in German, which began through in the Reformation and continued, and he was a part of that. One of his distinctives was the unity of God's people. He really cared about the church being connected and unified. Thus, we get the name Brethren, right? That we're brothers and sisters. That's something really profoundly important about his legacy. Another part of his legacy is that communion was weekly, right? Out of the Catholic Church into the Reformation. Somewhere along the way, and many denominations later, we had lost weekly communion. It was Pastor John Darby that held to weekly communion, that the brethren of the saints would unite themselves to Christ weekly and experience the grace of communion, something that we do every week in Living Stones. That's a part of Pastor John Darby's legacy. But maybe most of all, John Darby would be known for his emphasis on the return of Jesus. He looked out in his day and he was saying, no Christian or non-Christians, nobody is caring about the return of Christ. That our life matters now in light of the return of Jesus. And we're not just Christians kind of just living life through Christian morals, but we're actually waiting for the return of Christ. And so, although part of his theology is pre-tribulation rapture, he's attributed to that theology, and that's probably the mainline understanding of the return of Christ. But regardless of how Christ is going to return, whether there's a tribulation or not a tribulation, whether we're already post-trib or mid-trib, whatever that looks like for you, the emphasis, though, of Darby's legacy is on the return of Jesus. And he went to the grave preaching the return of Christ and the importance of that reality in the everyday believer. So we're thankful for pastor preacher John Darby and all he's brought. So the second one I want to talk about is somebody that you wouldn't know his name probably, although you do know his work. His name is Warren Sallman, and he is the painter who famously painted this picture called The Face of Christ. Now, this is a picture that we've seen it. It's been in magazines. This is like the common kind of picture of Jesus. And the thing is it's kind of mocked and made fun of. And this is the week that Eric Salmon was born. And so I just thought it would be neat because this picture has had such a significance in our culture and in Christian culture, and in the way that we view Jesus, that I just thought it'd be cool to talk about this guy. This guy became a Christian in Chicago at 16. He met Jesus in a revival, and it was radical. And I want you to hear his own words. Listen to what he says when he met Jesus. He said, "My burden of sin and guilt was removed, and I shall never forget the thrilling joy of that moment of experiencing God's redeeming grace. Since that time, my life has been based on that experience and has been directed towards serving God in every way." The guy had a radical conversion to Jesus, and then he gave his whole life to serving and ministering to the church through the gifts and skills. At one point, after he got married, he got really sick. He was given just a few months to live. His wife, who loved Jesus and was faithful, challenged him to pray and pray and pray. And so they prayed together, and God healed him. And it was after that event, he ended up painting this picture. Now, how this came about is there was a Christian magazine, asked him to paint a picture of the face of Christ for the cover of this magazine. But he was distraught. He wasn't sure how he was going to do it and how to display Jesus both in his regalness and his beauty and his softness, and kind of get all the aspects of Jesus. And he remembered what the director of Moody Bible Institute out of Chicago had once said, and this was Professor Dr. Sellers. And Dr. Sellers had said once to him, "Make him a real man, make him rugged, not effeminate, make him strong and masculine, not weak, so people will see in his face that he slept under the stars and drove the money changers out of the temple and faced Calvary in triumph." That was his goal. He went to bed one night, he had a dream. He said he saw the face that he was to paint. He woke up and he painted this famous face of Christ. A couple things I just want to talk through. One is he was a radical man who loved Jesus. His goal was to worship Jesus, and in this painting to use his gifts to minister to the church. That was his hope, and that was his heart. Even though we look at this painting, we're like, kind of outdated, doesn't fit. Jesus probably didn't look this way. And like you, and I have done this too, I've mocked this picture. You know, I've talked about how Jesus looks like he's part of a beauty pageant. It looks like not anything but not masculine, but effeminate. And here's the thing: is context is everything. When Warner Sallman painted this picture, it was meant to embody all of those goals that I had read, and yet in that time it did show Jesus' regalness. It did show his beauty. It did show his masculinity. And sometimes in our modern eyes, with the context changes, beauty changes, strength changes, majesty changes, all of those things change as context develops. Sometimes through the pride of our modern eyes, we judge the past, but context is everything. And we have to see his work in the context of the time in which he painted it. But I'd like to point one more thing out about his context. One of the things that we make fun of this picture is we'll say phrases like, well, Jesus, he doesn't look Swedish. He was a Jewish man, right? A Middle Eastern Jewish man. He was browner, darker. He didn't have long flowing hair and blue eyes. And we make the statement Jesus wasn't Swedish, right? Here's what's fascinating. Warner Sallman was born to Swedish parents. When we look at this picture, why does Jesus look somewhat Swedish? It's because he was Swedish. And he did what we all do, which is we have a context bias, and that is we view things according to who we are and what we're like and the values in our own culture. And so Sallman painted a Swedish Jesus. Why? Because he was Swedish. He had context bias. He saw Jesus through his own eyes, through his own culture, and we do that. And I think in one sense it's like we all see through particular eyes, the eyes of our own context. And we have to be mindful that what we want is not a Jesus of our image, but we want to be made in the image of Jesus. We want to know the actual, factual, historical Jesus. It's not a sin to paint him Swedish, but it makes sense why he looks Swedish. And I wonder if our issue with Swedish Jesus isn't that he looks more Swedish than Jewish. Maybe it's because he looks he doesn't look like us. And maybe what we actually want is a Jesus made in our image. Food for thought. Warner Sallman loved Jesus. John Darby loved Jesus. And this week in church history, here's two aspects that challenge us, cause us to think, are informative and helpful. See you next week.